Sputnik and the birth of the space race. Launched on October 4, 1957, Sputnik was the first man-made object to orbit in outer space. And while the Soviet satellite sent out nothing more menacing than innocent radio signals, what terrified Americans was the rocket that propelled Sputnik into low Earth orbit. Soviet leaders were quick to point out that the rocket that carried Sputnik into space was equally capable of launching nuclear warheads at their Cold War enemies in the West. American exceptionalism became instantly strained by the Soviets' boast, terrifying average Americans and politicians alike with the fact that America had been caught flat-footed in the face of the Soviets' early lead into space.
What went wrong? How did a nation of backward peasants forge so dramatically ahead of us in the race to space?
A foreign country, especially an enemy country, can do this. We fear this. We fear that they have something out that majority of the people don't know about.
The people of the United States have been humiliated, they're disturbed, and they're unhappy.
Dominance of this completely new area? Well, I think the consequences are fairly plain. Probable Soviet world domination.
The very public failure of America's own satellite, the Vanguard TV-3 on December 6, 1957, only served to heighten the public's perception that the U.S. lagged far behind the Soviets when it came to potential military dominance in space. On January 31, 1958, America finally achieved some degree of parity with the Soviets after the successful launch of Explorer 1 by the Army Ballistic Missile Agency. Despite this early success, however, President Eisenhower urged his countrymen to react with resourcefulness and vigor, while his administration further led the charge by dismantling the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics and replacing it with NASA on October 1, 1958. From that day onward, America would steadily outperform the Soviet space program with its compelling successes during the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo manned space flights, which would ultimately beat the Russians to the moon when on July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong first set foot on the lunar surface.
I'm going to step off the limb. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Laika, the first canine in space.
NBC News presents a special report on the Russian launching of a second Earth satellite. And now to guide this report here in New York is NBC News commentator Merrill Muller.
Good afternoon. A dog knocked a goat right out of the world's attention today. In a masterpiece of propaganda timing, the Soviet Union announced it had launched Sputnik No. 2, carrying a live dog. This is reportedly history's first space traveler.
Laika the dog, the commander of Sputnik 2, grew up on the streets of Moscow, possessing little vision about being the first living creature in space. Chosen for her ability to withstand centrifugal G-forces and a superior aptitude for sitting, eating, and going to the bathroom in a confined space, Laika would soon be the first living creature to be launched into space. After the historic and quite polarizing launch of Sputnik 1, which instantly ignited the Cold War space race between the United States and the Soviet Union, Russian leader Nikita Khrushchev ordered a second triumphant spaceflight to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. Khrushchev's order left Soviet scientists with less than a month to accomplish the feat. On November 3, 1957, Laika the dog would become the first living being ever to be launched into space. On launch day, telemetric sensors recorded a threefold increase in Laika's heart rate, while the G-forces during liftoff caused the animal's respiratory rate to increase fivefold. Once in space, Laika's breathing and heart rate grew slower and deeper, despite the deteriorating conditions inside the tiny capsule. While the Soviet space program learned much about mammalian physiology in space, Sputnik 2 was so hastily assembled that the program had no plan to safely return Laika to Earth. By Laika's second orbit, a gross miscalculation in thermodynamics caused the space capsule to become increasingly overheated. By the fourth orbit, some 5 hours into the flight, Laika's telemetrics went silent, ending the life of the first living being in space. 4 years later, Yuri Gagarin accelerated the Soviets' lead in the space race when the cosmonaut orbited the Earth for 108 minutes before parachuting from his capsule after re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. Today on the Daily Dose, Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space. Born in the village of Klushino near Gazatsk, a city that would later bear his name, Yuri Gagarin flew for the Soviet Air Forces before being selected along with 5 other cosmonauts for the Soviet space program. As the Cold War and subsequent space race escalated between the United States and the USSR, Gagarin would stun the world by beating the Americans into space. On April 12, 1961, Gagarin boarded his Vostok 1 space capsule for a successful liftoff. He orbited the Earth for 108 minutes before re-entering Earth's atmosphere, ejecting from his capsule at 23,000 feet for a parachute drop safely down to Earth. Gagarin became an instant national hero and was awarded the Soviet Union's highest medal for valor. Beginning in 1962, the Soviet Union began celebrating the day of Gagarin's flight as Cosmonautics Day, which was later renamed International Day of Human Spaceflight. The flight would be his sole trip into space, although he did serve as backup crew for the ill-fated Soyuz 1 spaceflight, which ended in a fatal crash, killing his friend and fellow cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov. Fearing for the life of their national hero, Soviet officials permanently banned Gagarin from further spaceflights. He died in 1968 when his MiG-15 training jet crashed near the town of Kurtsak, taking the life of Gagarin and flight instructor Vladimir Zorogin. Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space. After cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space in 1961, director of cosmonaut training Nikolai Kakamin read in an American media source that female pilots in the U.S. were training to become astronauts. As a result, Kakamin gained approval for an all-female cosmonaut program, which began training in 1963. Born on March 6, 1937, textile worker Valentina Tereshkova had no previous desire to fly in space. However, her love of skydiving made her an excellent candidate for the Soviet space program. Training included isolation tests, centrifuge G-force tests, thermo-chamber tests, decompression chamber tests, and pilot training in MiG-15 fighter jets. On June 16, 1963, Tereshkova reached outer space in her Vostok 6 rocket after a flawless liftoff. Although she experienced nausea and physical discomfort for most of the flight, she orbited the Earth 48 times in just under 3 days, making her the first and only woman to solo in space. As was the protocol in all Vostok missions, Tereshkova ejected from her capsule during its descent at about 4 miles above the Earth, parachuting to the ground in Kazakhstan on June 19, 1963. After the dissolution of the first group of female cosmonauts in 1969, Tereshkova stayed on at the Soviet space program as an instructor, graduating from the Zhukovsky Air Force Engineering Academy and retiring from the Air Force in 1997, having attained the rank of Major General. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Tereshkova was elected in 2011 to the National State Duma, much like the American House of Representatives, re-elected for a second term in 2016. Today on the Daily Dose, Alan Shepard, the first American in space. A graduate of the Naval Academy at Annapolis, Alan Shepard saw action in the Navy during World War II, becoming a naval aviator in 1946 and a test pilot in 1950. Selected as one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts in 1959, Shepard proved to be the definition of the right stuff when he piloted his Mercury Redstone 3 rocket into space on May 5, 1961. Before ascending up to the capsule, Shepard paused to admire his massive rocket, later recalling that he suddenly realized he would never see the beast again. Flight delays rolled on for more than 4 hours until he finally asked for a bathroom break. Denied by the flight director, Shepard was encouraged by ground personnel to simply let it go. He later recalled that he was completely dry by liftoff due to the wicking nature of his cotton undergarments and the capsule's environment of 100% oxygen. Named Freedom 7 by Shepard himself, his 15-minute flight would take him 150 miles up into space, where he was able to fully control the pitch, roll, and yaw of his spacecraft. Upon his return to Earth, Shepard became an instant national celebrity, flying into space a mere 3 weeks after Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space. Designated as the commander of the first crewed Gemini flight, he was grounded in 1963 due to Meniere's disease, an inner ear condition that causes extreme bouts of dizziness and nausea. After the ailment was surgically corrected in 1969, Shepard commanded Apollo 14, becoming the 5th and oldest man to walk on the moon. One of the crew had smuggled the head of a 6-iron in one of their utility pockets of their spacesuits, and when Shepard attached the head to a shaft-like piece of the lunar lander, he took 4 one-handed swings on the moon due to the restrictive nature of his spacesuit. While the record for the longest golf shot on Earth is held by Mike Austin at 515 yards, when Shepard finally connected on his final shot, it is estimated that the ball traveled upwards of 1 mile, or 1,760 yards, through the moon's reduced gravitational pull. On the moon, anyway, we're going to need a bigger course. How NASA sold the moon to a skeptical nation. NASA's ability to market manned spaceflight became as essential to American support and funding as the astronauts and equipment that got them there.
The eyes of the world now look into space, to the moon, and to the planets beyond.
The idea that Americans wanted to go to the moon was so audacious that NASA had to market the excitement and upside of space travel to skeptics in Congress and the population at large, since to land men on the moon would cost 4% of the national budget for a full decade to come. To gain public support for such a bold endeavor, NASA set out to market the moon with everything in its toolbox. The amount of detail NASA provided for each mission was monumental, including an abundance of photographs both on the ground and deep into space. NASA ultimately growing mass interest and support for the space program to a fevered pitch by the time Apollo 11 was scheduled to fly. Before the first historic landing on the moon, NASA provided an almost 300-page press kit for journalists, allowing different types of media to pick and choose what they wanted to talk about, be it a focus on the spacecraft itself or biographies of the men tucked inside them. How an astronaut went to the bathroom or ate in space was readily shared in every detail, further galvanizing its audience to the wonders of manned spaceflight. NASA also encouraged consumer companies to amplify the excitement.
But the astronauts do some things you do. In space, they drank Tang. Tang, chosen for the Gemini astronauts. Have a blast. Have some Tang.
And here's a new way to help keep you in shape for the space age. New Post Count-Off, the cereal you can count on. Post Count-Off is made with nutritious oats. You can count on it.
Public opinion surveys from the 1960s showed that most Americans readily approved of putting men on the moon. However, after the high-water moment of Neil Armstrong's first steps on the lunar surface, considered by most to be a victory for human achievement, Interest and support began to evaporate rapidly, and when Congress pulled funding for the last 3 planned Apollo space flights, Apollo 17 would become the last time men successfully set foot on the moon. NASA picks the right stuff. On October 4th, 1957, the USSR scored the first victory of the space race when they successfully launched the world's first artificial satellite into low Earth orbit. In response to Russia's Sputnik launch, the United States formed NASA, which dedicated itself to beating the Soviets in the pursuit of manned spaceflight. In January 1959, NASA began screening the records of 508 military test pilots before choosing 110 candidates. The candidates were arbitrarily split into 3 groups, but due to an overwhelming volunteer rate, one of the groups was randomly eliminated. After a battery of written tests, interviews, and medical history reviews, 32 candidates traveled to Lovelace Clinic in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where they underwent exhaustive medical and psychological testing, but the group proved to be so fit that only 1 man was eliminated. The remaining 31 candidates then traveled to Wright Aeromedical Laboratory in Dayton, Ohio, where they underwent the most grueling part of the selection process. For 6 days and 3 nights, the men were subjected to various tortures that tested their tolerance to physical and psychological stress, spending hours in freezing pressure chambers that simulated 65,000 feet of altitude, followed by heat chambers that reached temperatures of 130 degrees Fahrenheit. From these 31 candidates, NASA selected 7 men who would become known as the Mercury 7. On April 9, 1959, NASA introduced America's first astronauts to the world, consisting of Scott Carpenter, Gordo Cooper, John Glenn, Gus Grissom, Wally Schirra, Alan Shepard, and Deke Slayton.
Ladies and gentlemen, today we are introducing to you and to the world these 7 men who have been selected to begin training for orbital space flight.
I don't think any of us could really go on with something like this. We didn't have pretty good backing at home, really. My wife's attitude toward this has been the same as it has been all along through all my flying, that if it's what I want to do, and she's behind it, and the kids are too, 100%.
I have no problems at home. My family's in complete agreement.
The first men on the moon. After the Apollo 1 launch pad fire that tragically took the lives of Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, Apollo mission engineers and key flight leaders paused to reassess the risks of a successful manned mission to the moon and back, identifying 13 risk stages and risk reduction controls before launching a single unmanned test flight, followed by 3 manned flights that concluded with Apollo 10's successful orbital flights around the moon. Apollo 11 was to follow, landing 2 men on the moon in an event that saw the world hold its collective breath during liftoff in a tense lunar landing, followed by a second collective gasp of wonder when Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon. Launching into an Earth orbit of 114 by 116 miles on July 16, 1969, with Commander Neil Armstrong, Command Module Pilot Michael Collins, and Lunar Module Pilot Edwin Buzz Aldrin. 2 hours and 44 minutes later, the crew refired their SIVB stage rocket for a 5-minute burn, successfully placing Apollo 11 into trans-lunar orbit, followed by a 3-second burn a day later for a planned mid-course correction. Celebrating the first color TV transmission to Earth, on the 4th day of their flight, the Eagle lunar landing vehicle undocked from Columbia for its descent to the lunar surface. Changing course at the last minute, due to previously unseen obstacles in their intended landing zone, before touching down in the Sea of Tranquility, just as the Eagle ran out of fuel. Spending 21 hours and 36 minutes on the lunar surface, Armstrong and Aldrin blasted off the moon on July 21st for a successful redocking with Columbia at 128 hours and 3 minutes into Apollo 11's flight. After the lunar module was jettisoned 4 hours later, the Command Service Module achieved trans-Earth injection that same day, splashing down in the Pacific Ocean on July 24, 1969, after a flight of 195 hours, 18 minutes and 35 seconds, an achievement that pushed the boundaries of human exploration in space. Now 54 years later, NASA plans to return to the moon as early as 2024, with planned lunar landings in 2025 or 2026, this time with digital rather than analog technology, making Apollo 11 a seminal achievement just 66 years after the Wright brothers' first flight. The last men on the moon.
The eyes of the world now look into space, to the moon, and to the planets beyond.
After John F. Kennedy's now famous "Let's go to the moon" speech, 1/5 of humanity watched Neil Armstrong walk on the lunar surface. But after multiple Apollo flights would follow Armstrong's achievement, the world, along with American politicians engaged in an expensive war in Southeast Asia, seemed to lose interest in the technological wonders of putting men on the moon and returning them safely back to Earth. When budget cuts came down from Washington, NASA was forced to cancel its last 3 missions, making Apollo 17 the last time men would walk on the moon. The 12-day mission in December of 1972 included Commander Gene Cernan, Module Pilot Jack Schmitt, and Command Module Pilot Ronald Evans. And while the crew has been written up in history books and acknowledged by the space and scientific communities, none have received the public recognition they so rightly deserved. Apollo 17 broke multiple records, including 3 days on the lunar surface, with moonwalks lasting up to 8 hours at a crack. After landing in the Taurus-Littrow Valley, they deployed scientific instruments while collecting a treasure trove of lunar samples for scientists to study back on Earth. Apollo 17 was the first mission to have no one on board who had been a test pilot, and also marked the first night launch in U.S. human spaceflight history. While the 3 unused Apollo spacecraft were later repurposed in the Skylab and Apollo-Soyuz program, Apollo 17 marked the last launch of a Saturn V rocket. Now that Americans have a growing interest in returning to the moon before conquering a landing on Mars, a hearty salute to the nearly 400,000 men and women who made the Apollo moon landings a high-water mark in human achievement. The Space Shuttle program. Christened by NASA as the Space Transportation System, or STS, the Space Shuttle project was taken from a 1969 proposed conception for a system of partially reusable low Earth orbit spacecraft. The first of 4 orbital test flights occurred in 1981, leading to the first operational flights beginning in 1982. 5 Space Shuttle orbiters were built and flown on a total of 135 missions from 1981 to 2011, including 2 flight failures which resulted in the deaths of 14 astronauts. The Space Shuttle missions launched numerous satellites, interplanetary probes, and the Hubble Space Telescope, as well as the construction and servicing of the International Space Station. The shuttle fleet's total mission time was 1,322 days, 19 hours, 21 minutes, and 23 seconds. The primary components that made shuttle flights a reality included the shuttle itself with 3 Rocketdyne main engines, a pair of recoverable solid rocket boosters, and the expendable external center tank containing liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. Once its external launch engines were discarded in low Earth orbit, the shuttle relied on its orbital maneuvering system engines to navigate the vacuum of space, as well as to execute its deorbit burn for re-entry into Earth's atmosphere for a landing at Florida's Kennedy Space Center or the Rogers Dry Lake Bed at Edwards Air Force Base in California. If weather conditions required the shuttle to land at Edwards, the orbiter was flown back to Kennedy Space Center on the shuttle carrier aircraft, a specially modified Boeing 747. The first orbiter, Enterprise, was built in 1976 and used exclusively as an approach and landing test vehicle with no orbital capabilities. The 4 fully operational orbiters were the Columbia, Challenger, Discovery, and Atlantis, of which 2 were lost to mission accidents. The first was the Challenger on January 28, 1986, when an inexpensive O-ring seal failed at liftoff in the right solid rocket booster, which was not designed to handle the unusually cold conditions that existed at launch time. The breakup cost the lives of 7 astronauts. The second was the Columbia disaster of February 1, 2003, when the ship suffered a structural failure upon re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. 7 more astronauts died when a piece of foam insulation broke off the shuttle's external tank during liftoff, damaging the left wing of the orbiter. Upon re-entry, the damaged left wing heat shield allowed hot atmospheric gases to penetrate and compromise the left wing's internal structure, causing the craft to break apart upon re-entry. A 5th operational orbiter, the Endeavour, was built in 1991 to replace the Challenger.